Hello everyone, Sam here, and we gotta talk about Ravenwood, Stepson of Mystery. This was a pulp character that was written by Frederick C. Davis, and the collection I have here is the complete series of his original 5 stories in the pulp magazine Secret Agent X. These stories were originally published in or from March to October 1936. Some months were skipped, but that was the period they were published in Secret Agent X, which was published by the pulp publisher Ace. Ace was not as big as Street and Smith or Popular, but they did have a presence in the pulp magazine field. Secret Agent X was their most well-known character, but they had a variety of others. And Davis, who wrote these Ravenwood stories, was actually a fairly well-known pulp writer. His most famous creation in the pulp field was probably the Moon Man. I mentioned him in my first video regarding Secret Agent X and Dr. Death. But that was his most popular character and his most well-known. Also for Ace, who he created him for. But he also wrote a character called Operator Number 5 for 2 years. I don't know that much about Operator Number 5, but I have heard his name thrown around a fair amount, so I recognize the name, if not the character. But the point is that Davis had his fingers in a lot of known and respected pulp characters, and Ravenwood was a backup character for Secret Agent X magazine. And basically what a backup character was there, with pulp magazines, you generally had the main feature. There was always for a character magazine like The Shadow or Doc Savage or The Spider, you had a story that was the main story of those characters that was the cover story and was the main focus of the magazine. It was the main content of that particular issue. But a backup character was basically the short stories that were in the back of the magazine, because many pulp publishers would put short stories after the main novel or novella that was in the front of the magazine. So Secret Agent X obviously was focused on Secret Agent X, but there were backup characters in the back of the Secret Agent X magazine. And that's what Ravenwood was. This was not the only backup character that Davis had. He also had one named Mark Hazard. As I understand it, Mark Hazard was basically this crusading district attorney who was always trying to catch the bad guys, but he was secretly a death row inmate who had been falsely accused but managed to escape. And it was always sort of hanging over his head that if people discovered who he was, he'd be in big trouble. So that was another backup character that Davis did for Secret Agent X. But we're focusing on Ravenwood today. And the main reason I got this story was that if you've watched my channel from the beginning, you know that I kind of got an interest in occult detectives. And Ravenwood was not the first occult detective, but he was a fairly early one. Occult detectives actually predate a lot of the pulp magazines, but there were occult detectives published in pulp magazines, and Ravenwood was one of the most notable ones, despite the fact he only appeared in 5 stories originally. I was also interested because Will Murray, I mentioned Secret Agent X versus Dr. Death. He stated that he actually used the Ravenwood character in that story. So I was like, well, I better research and check out Ravenwood's original stories, because I actually told Will Murray this at Pulp Fest earlier this year, that I really didn't like reading crossover stories where I didn't really know much about the crossover characters, because that's kind of a case where I always have a fear that I read something a crossover and I like the characters in the crossover, but then I learn, oh, this actually isn't that accurate to the how the characters are supposed to act in their main features, and so it becomes sort of discombobulated. And then I go back and or I read a crossover and I don't like how the characters are portrayed, and so I don't bother checking out where the original characters came from, because I'm like, oh, if they're like that, I don't want to read more stories with them. But then it turns out they're not like that. So I always prefer reading the original stories, or at least some of the original stories, for a character involved in a crossover before I read the crossover. So that's one of the main reasons I read Ravenwood. This was an edition put out by Steger Books. I think this was back when they were Altus Press. Yeah, Altus Press 2008, this edition. When I bought it from them, they were Steger. Yeah, this is where I got this edition. And, yeah. So what is the story of Ravenwood, Stepson of Mystery? Well, Ravenwood, as I mentioned, is an occult detective. He lives in Los Angeles. He lives in this penthouse in a skyscraper, and he investigates these strange crimes for his clients. They often involve some weird or macabre thing that has the stench of the supernatural, and Ravenwood gets involved because he's somewhat supernatural himself. And that's actually kind of the main gimmick for this story, which is that Ravenwood actually has occult powers. And this actually was not as common in the pulp era as you would think. There were obviously story magazines like Weird Tales that had elements of magic in them, but Ravenwood was somewhat unique for the era, and even among occult detectives of the time, for actually having explicitly occult and supernatural abilities. That's not all that unusual today when you read a lot of modern occult detective stories, but this actually was somewhat of an interesting gimmick for the time. And Ravenwood, his occult powers aren't flashy. He only really has two powers, and that's he has a limited sixth sense. He can learn things that he shouldn't know just because he has a limited sixth sense. And he also has a certain amount of precognition. He can sort of see into the future, not by much, usually only by a few seconds or a few minutes, but that saves his life several times because he sees what's coming. And that's one of his main methods of learning information, like having this sixth sense and a certain amount of precognition. But he also is a apt and able private detective. And it's interesting because he actually learned these powers from a mystic. And the mystic, his name is that he has no name. He is simply called the Nameless One, because he is so old and so ancient that his name has been lost to time. And he is the titular stepfather who makes Ravenwood the stepson of mystery, because when Ravenwood was a boy, Ravenwood's father in India saved the Nameless One from a tiger attack. And the Nameless One said, I will watch over you and your flesh from now on as thanks. But sometime later, a couple of years later, Ravenwood parents both die in this outbreak that happens in India, and the Nameless One adopts Ravenwood. And he teaches him the mystic arts and helps him develop these abilities. And one of the interesting things is that the Nameless One actually lives with Ravenwood in the penthouse. He has his own room that is like decked out in the typical Indian and Hindu accoutrements, and he helps Ravenwood with his investigations because he has much more powerful seer-like abilities. He can look far into the past, far into the future. He has a certain amount of like a mental projection, so he's a much more powerful figure in the mystic arts. But there's also two other recurring characters. One is Ravenwood's valet slash butler, whose name is Sterling. And one of the interesting things about Sterling is that Sterling doesn't really know what's going on with Ravenwood and his investigations. You know, he is not like an Alfred Pennyworth who is like totally locked in with Bruce Wayne and knows everything that's going on with Batman. Sterling really doesn't really have a firm idea about what's going on. He knows his boss is kind of strange, but he just sort of follows Ravenwood's instructions and just doesn't seem to bat an eye at all these weird things Ravenwood is doing. And then you also have Stagg, who is a Los Angeles police inspector who really doesn't like Ravenwood because Ravenwood keeps involving himself in all these weird criminal investigations, and Stagg thinks Ravenwood has something to do with all these crimes, and he's always looking for some reason or excuse to nail him and get him for these crimes. But of course, Ravenwood always manages to be a little slippery, and Stagg can never really nail him for these crimes he thinks Ravenwood is doing. It's kind of similar to that inspector from the Saint series, because the Saint was always doing like sort of extra legal stuff, and what was his name? Inspector Teal. Inspector Teal was always kind of trying to get him for these crimes he suspected him of, but it could never really pin them on him. So that's the essential setup for all of these Ravenwood stories. So normally when I do these reviews, I sort of these reviews for short story collections, I generally would go by each story, talking about what works in each story, what doesn't, and then give a final review based on my accumulated feelings on the various stories. But this is one where I'm actually just going to talk about the stories as a group. There's a very good reason for that. You'll see it in a little bit, but I'm going to talk about them in terms of a group, and what I think work and what I think don't work about these stories. To start about what works, I think this is a collection that really highlights Frederick C. Davis's talent as a writer, especially in respects to the atmosphere, because like any good occult detective series, there's a lot of creepy and haunting imagery in here that Davis does a very good job at portraying. There's some great foreboding locations, like there's this one museum with a creepy shrine, and it's after hours, so the museum looks even creepier than usual. One of the stories takes place largely in a cemetery or a house right next to the cemetery, and it's a very foreboding environment. And there's even one story that is essentially a haunted house slash mad scientist lab. Uh, and again, Davis is doing a great job of really making these creepy locations and making you feel very uncomfortable to be in them. And it's not just like writing, oh, the places are dark. He does go into some good detail about why these locations are so off-putting. So that was probably my favorite element of these stories, just how much Davis is able to convey how creepy and off-putting these places are. Probably my favorite character in the stories was Sterling, the valet slash butler, because he doesn't really react to all the weirdness happening around him. Like, Ravenwood tells him to do certain things that that if you don't know what he's doing of his investigations, you would scratching your head going, why are you doing that? And but Sterling doesn't seem to bat an eye. He just kind of does what Ravenwood tells him to do. And he doesn't seem to have much curiosity about all these weird events that involve, like, killer shrines, killer snakes, evil cars. Just all these really bizarre things, but Sterling just doesn't seem to... He doesn't seem to care much about everything, which I kind of found funny and and entertaining in its own right. I do kind of like characters like that who don't react to the weirdness and strangeness, whether it's because they've experienced it all or they just don't care. That was kind of entertaining. Another thing I kind of enjoyed was that this story actually involves Far East mysticism, which wasn't necessarily unusual in pulp magazine era, but this one actually uses a very specific Asian mysticism, which is Indian mysticism, because the Nameless One and Ravenwood are explicitly stated to be practicing yoga, which is the spiritualist practice often done in India. It's heavily associated with Hinduism, but I've seen other people say that there are some proponents who work outside of Hinduism. Hinduism is the one it's most associated with, however. And it was kind of interesting that they highlight this as a specific Indian mysticism instead of like being kind of vague about it, like how a lot of pulp magazines would have been. The only other example I know of like a specific Indian or a specific nationality mysticism is from The Shadow, because in one of his stories he teamed up with a lama from Tibet, and that was kind of the one other time I've seen a specific mysticism named, and it wasn't just a broad thing of say, oh, it's a magic from the East. This one, they do give a definitive Eastern philosophy and belief system, which was kind of interesting and refreshing. I also kind of like that Ravenwood has a very good inner conflict, because one of the things about Ravenwood is that he is actively practicing in yoga. He is trying to learn as much as he can from the Nameless One, and he is developing certain abilities because of his practice of it. But he's not really able to fully embrace it because his Western heritage is kind of incompatible with that Eastern mysticism, and he's always in a constant hurry. It's mentioned that he's like hot-blooded, and he wants to help and save and try to help everyone as fast and quickly as he can. But the Nameless One reminds him, yoga does not necessitate or preach this idea of hurriedness. You got to do it. It's much more relaxed. It's much more fateful. Certain things are going to happen if they happen, and there's this not this rush to get forward, but this slow continuance. And it's kind of an interesting conflict to see a character who can't really fully accept his adopted belief system, but he's trying all the time. There's actually a good passage in here that I think kind of sums it up. Yeah, here's the passage. Quote, "Year after year, under the oracular guidance of the Nameless One, whose every glance and every word were suffused with the wisdom of untold ages, Ravenwood had striven to absorb the teachings of yoga. His impatient, active Western temperament, incompatible with the apathetic abstraction of the Oriental, barred him forever from complete success. But he had won himself strange powers rarely granted to any but the native faithful. His ability to call upon forces inconceivable to his fellow men marked Ravenwood as a man apart." So essentially, he can't be fully accepted by the East because his Western temperament just is not compatible with the teachings of yoga. But because he's been so enmeshed in the teachings of yoga, he's not really connected to his Western half as well. There are characters throughout the stories who are just kind of baffled by Ravenwood's way of holding himself and his attitude. And he's, like this text says, he's a man apart. He's not really... He's got one foot in the East and one foot in the West, and he just can't quite get into either section. And that, I think, is a very interesting character conflict. In regards to what I think are the best stories in this collection, of the 5, I would say that there are 2 that I think work fairly well. One is Crucibles of the Damned, and I really like that one because it does have a very creepy setting with that cemetery I mentioned earlier, and it is very macabre. Like, it does do a good job at the macabreness of the subject matter, and where the story goes towards the end, I went, okay, that I didn't see that coming, and it is kind of an interesting twist. So that was probably one of the stronger stories. Probably my favorite one was the last one, The Phantom Juggernaut. Because that one kind of has a good mystery gimmick with basically there's this car with no driver that's driving around Los Angeles and running people down. And that's kind of an interesting murder weapon and kind of an interesting idea of there being no driver. And it's very reminiscent of that very early Steven Spielberg film Duel, where the guy is being chased by a killer truck. And the Phantom Juggernaut just reminded me of that story. And I was kind of like, okay, it's a fun sort of take on the killer car story concept. So I really enjoyed that story. So that's what I enjoyed about Ravenwood. But now I have to talk about what I didn't like. And this is kind of a difficult thing to talk about without spoiling the stories. So if you really don't want to hear about the spoilers, you want to go, you just want to see my final ranking. I have timestamps where you can just go to the final ranking if you don't want to hear spoilers. But I kind of, but I do have to sort of spoil the stories because there's a certain element about the stories that really, I think, drags them down, and it involves the ending and the reveals. So if you really don't want those spoiled, you can just go to the final ranking section that will be timestamped in the description. Okay, for those who are willing to listen to this, or you're aware of these stories, probably my biggest problem with the stories is that the stories are all the same in terms of setups and their plot reveals. And what I mean by that is that the stories are initially presented as something supernatural is going on. Weird things are happening in museums. People are getting killed by killer handshakes. A mysterious car is running people down. So all these things that are presenting themselves as supernatural occurrences. But every single plot reveal that happens in all 5 of these stories reveals that these are not actually supernatural. They're people who have been able to cleverly manipulate things or portray them as supernatural. And Ravenwood always reveals, with the help of his powers, that no, these aren't actually supernatural events. These are people doing the typical Scooby-Doo stuff of making you think there's a ghost, but there actually isn't. And that would be fine if it was like 1 or 2 of these stories, but it's all of them, all 5 of them. And I don't think I need to explain to you how that kind of gets a little tedious when you're reading all these stories, and you're always presented with the fact that no, supernatural abilities exist in this world, but it never turns out the villain is actually using them. It's only the hero. And that just takes a lot of the fun out of the stories at a certain point, because eventually, by the second or third story, you're going, oh, okay, this isn't going to go to any other story conceit. It's not going to be like Karnaki, the Ghost Finder, where sometimes it is a fake ghost, but other times there's signs it's a real ghost. This one, no, they're all fakes. And this is an instance where I think the format of pulp magazines in their backup stories kind of works against these tales, because when these tales were in Secret Agent X, they were all individual. They were spaced out by at least a month. There were many times where readers wouldn't read the other stories because they'd only read one Secret Agent X issue and then never get one that had any of these Ravenwood stories in again. And thus, the reveals of the fakery of the villains might be more effective because they would only see it once, and it could be a neat surprise for the readers then, because since they read no other Ravenwood tales and they were baited by the fact that Ravenwood has powers himself, and they're baited to think that, oh, the villain is also using supernatural stuff. The stories probably work by themselves if a reader was reading them that way in the original pulp magazine. But the problem is when you put them all in a collection and their story setups and plot reveals are all the same, it gets very grating, because you start reading these and going, oh, this is going to happen, then this is going to happen, then this is going to happen, and it all happens exactly the same. The only difference is minor details and the nature of the monster or villain. So this is one where I feel like if I had read this in the original way it was intended, with one story in Secret Agent X magazine and then spaced out over a couple months, I might have liked more. But when you read them all concurrently in a story collection, it does not hit as well as it should. And the story setup and the plot reveals, they get more expected, and that's not a great thing for a mystery story. You're not supposed to be able to suspect what's going on just by sheer happenstance, simply because you've read all the stories. But yeah, that's my biggest problem with these stories, and some of that isn't really Davis's fault, because again, these were written as backup stories in a magazine. They weren't supposed to be next to each other. But when you see how formulaic they are with them all being in this single collection, it does kind of kill the enjoyment of them. And it also kind of creates an issue in the sense of the Ravenwood and the Nameless One in terms of their power level. Because since none of the villains have any supernatural abilities, they're all charlatans, Ravenwood and the Nameless One kind of become overpowered because they have these seer-like abilities. They know what's going to happen. They can see into the past to see details that nobody could have reasonably gotten through investigation. So it reaches the point of like, well, gee, if the Nameless One at least is this enlightened, how is he not seeing these things as right before they happen, or how is he not seeing these crimes as they occur? And the plot explanation is, well, the Nameless One is kind of on such a higher level of existence and consciousness that he doesn't really get Ravenwood's drive for justice and rushing to get the bad guy. But it does kind of become a thing of, well, they're so overpowered that you don't just start wondering, well, why aren't they, like, immediately looking, saying, oh yeah, that's the guy who committed a crime, go get him. Which is always kind of a problem with any magical abilities or any precognition abilities. You're always kind of wondering, well, why didn't they see that coming? Or how are they not able to figure this stuff out? So yeah, the fact that the heroes are very overpowered just kind of makes it seem like the story is spinning its wheels. Like we have to do a typical mystery investigation, even though these characters should not theoretically have this much trouble. So, but if the Nameless One is overpowered, one of the weird things is that Ravenwood is kind of weirdly underpowered. Because I think Davis sort of realized what I was mentioning about how wait, if they have this huge amount of seer-like abilities, how are they not able to see what these criminals are doing either beforehand or right after? Because the Nameless One is able to go years into the past to learn information that was not accessible or known to anybody. So it's kind of a weird thing of, well, wait, can't you just jump into the past to see when this crime happened and figure out who the villain is from that? But so for Ravenwood, Davis underpowers him. He gives him only a limited sixth sense and only a little bit of precognition. But it also, and he does that probably to make sure Ravenwood doesn't have too much of an edge on the criminals. But it's also a thing that you kind of go, again, because the Nameless One's right over there, you can't just ask him to see who the criminal is and leave it at that. So, because of that, Ravenwood's occult powers really are not that impressive. And some of that is from me having read occult detectives from modern writers who do give occult detectives much more impressive abilities. One I'm most familiar with is the Dresden Files. But yeah, it's kind of this weird thing where the Nameless One is overpowered and Ravenwood is underpowered. And it just gives the vibe of the powers are like that just so the story can happen. We don't want the Nameless One solving everything, even though he has the power to do so. But we can't have Ravenwood have too much power because then that skews everything a little too much against the criminals. So it's just a thing where the abilities and the supernatural elements kind of work against the stories in my mind because they just raise too many questions. And that's always kind of been a problem with me in regards to magic. One of the reasons I like the Dresden Files is that Jim Butcher explains the limitations of magic, what has to be done for certain things, and it makes sense internal. It's good internal logic. And here, it just kind of feels like the powers are there, but the internal logic is a little wonky. So, yeah, it was actually that element, that unique element of Ravenwood, of him actually having powers, that I actually thought was sort of the weakest element of the story. Or probably more the second weakest, now I think about it, because the constant reveals kind of drag the story down for me. I was also not particularly a fan of Stagg, the police detective, because, like a lot of these characters, he's just there to be an annoying obstruction. He's there because we can't have a cooperative police presence. We got to have someone who's sort of antagonistic to the character, and he's just there to be an obstruction. And that would be fine if he was entertaining, but he really isn't. He's just like yelling at Ravenwood all the time. It also starts to not make much sense because Ravenwood solves many of these cases, and he does provide evidence. Yet despite this, Stagg still suspects him the whole time. And it's just kind of like, at a certain point, you just kind of go, buddy, are you not seeing this guy who is a private detective, who is, investigating these things? Do you not think maybe he has a point when he provides all this evidence for you? So, again, he's just a character who's propped there because that's what the format demands. So, I really didn't care for him. Now, one thing I mentioned earlier is that the Nameless One and Ravenwood often use their powers to learn about clues and information that would not be perceptible to the reader or even anybody in the story. So, and that was kind of an issue for me because one of the fun elements of mysteries is the reader seeing all the information that the investigating character sees, and trying to put together what happened based on that information. And I think the best mysteries are the ones that don't hide anything. They show you everything you need to know. And part of the fun is trying to figure out what's going on and seeing if you call what the method of the crime was. But the nature of these Ravenwood stories, where they have to sort of use precognition and go in and see stuff, that means that a lot of readers won't be able to really solve the mystery themselves because a lot of the context is missing. They don't see. There's a lot of things the reader will not be able to perceive because the information is not presented necessarily in a way they would be able to figure things out. there are a few stories where I think Davis does do a good job with hinting at the reveal, like the Phantom Juggernaut. There actually is a pretty decent reveal about how the evil car is working. But there's a couple of them that I go, well, wait, how would you be able to figure that out based on the information you gave? And I really don't like it when mysteries essentially cheat, when they leave certain information out that changes the reveal. And it's not something anybody could have really picked up on. That's always in my mind been the mark of a weak mystery, because it doesn't let the reader figure out what's going on. It basically hides information. And this was an instance of that where I think it kind of became a problem for me in terms of enjoying these mysteries, because a lot of them had information that you really wouldn't be able to figure out based on the limited context you're given. So, yeah, the mysteries in here didn't really do much for me, especially because, as I said before, they all have the same reveal, too. So there's not much variety in that. And one thing that kind of bugged me the more I thought about it was that I said earlier that the interesting thing about Ravenwood was that he was kind of stuck in two worlds. That was kind of his inner conflict. But one of the problems with that, as I thought about it, was that because of that situation, Ravenwood really isn't able to progress as a character. He can't go full Eastern because that's sort of shut off from him due to his Western temperament, but he can't go full Western because he's had his mind open to the practices and abilities of yoga. And while that is interesting as a character conflict, it also means he can't really progress, because he can't go west, he can't go east, and that basically means his character is stuck right where he's at, being an occult detective PI, and there's nothing much else for him. And that I think is kind of a bummer from a writing standpoint. And essentially, and also the fact that all of his stories are very formulaic, they all follow the same setup and plot reveal, he really can't break out of that interpretation. He can't really have this deeper characterization unless someone violates the formula, unless someone does something much differently with the character. And actually, one thing that I wanted to bring up is that Airship 27 has done a lot of Ravenwood stories. There were at least 5, if I'm remembering correctly. And the Pulp Superfan, it was over a decade ago, he did a review on the original Ravenwood stories, as well as I think the first collection of Airship 27's Ravenwood stories. And he had this one quote that I thought was interesting when he was talking about the Airship 27 stories. I'm going to read it for you. Quote, "For me, the biggest issue with such works are whether the stories stay true to the original characters. I don't feel that authors need to ape the original style, but they shouldn't be making radical changes to the character. I don't mind if they make additions, so long as those additions seem to be something that could have happened with that character." And I would say 98% of the time, I would agree with that statement. I do think you do need to be relatively loyal to the characters' personalities and storyline. But I also think that that 2% margin of error comes from that I think are acceptable to deviate from the character for two reasons. One, the author has such a radical and interesting new take on the character that their vision justifies why they would do that interpretation. The second is if the original character just doesn't work, and you kind of need to do something new with their storylines and world just to make them a little more interesting. And that's kind of my opinion on Ravenwood, because this is a character who I think has a lot of potential, and there is definitely something to be done with this character with newer stories. But in order to do that, you kind of have to break out of the story formula that these stories make. Like, this is actually a case where I'm kind of more interested in what newer writers have done with Ravenwood, just because this original Ravenwood just doesn't do anything for me. It's a character of a lot of potential, but it's sort of hemmed in by the story formulas. So this is kind of a weird time where I'm kind of interested in those other more modern Ravenwood stories, just because I want to see what people did with this character, and seeing if they break him out of this formulaic style that Davis wrote him in. So this is kind of a weird case where I disagree with Pulp Superfan, just because I feel like doing anything different with Ravenwood is a step in the right direction, just because as written, I don't think there's as much here as Davis wrote him. So yeah, this was kind of a character I wasn't as fond of as I thought I might be. So the final ranking of Ravenwood, Stepson of Mystery. This is one that I rank on a 5-star system. 0 out of 5 being the worst, 5 out of 5 being the best. This is one where I don't feel happy about giving this grade, but it's the one that I earnestly think these stories deserve, and that's a 2 out of 5 stars, which in my verbiage is a painfully average set of stories. Not bad, not terrible, but painfully average. And in my verbiage, for those that don't know my ranking system, 2 out of 5 stars is a painfully average book. A 3 out of 5 stars is a pleasantly average book. And the difference is that a 3-star book is pleasantly average in the sense that, yeah, it doesn't really do anything new or original, and is not really a great story or story collection, but it succeeds in what it tries to do, and it works for what it's going for. And a painfully average story or story collection, which is 2 out of 5 stars, is one where the story / stories are not bad, but they become, but they're so average and so predictable and so seen so much that they kind of become uninteresting to read, and you don't really feel much fun reading them. Like a pleasantly average book, you'd be like, oh yeah, there wasn't anything new, but it was fine to go through it. 2 out of 5 ones are ones where you're sort of reading out of obligation. You kind of see where everything's going, but you're like, all right, I started reading this, I need to finish it. And that's kind of my feelings on Ravenwood. And I feel bad about it, because I do know people who do like Ravenwood as a character. And I would say, yeah, as a character, I think he is interesting. It's just the actual stories that I'm not all that vibing with. So yeah, I fully understand why someone likes Ravenwood the character, but as for me, Ravenwood the stories of Ravenwood, they don't really work for me. So yeah, this is a 2 out of 5 stars collection. And like I said, I do like Ravenwood's inner conflict. I think Davis does a good job with the environmental descriptions and the atmosphere, and it is definitely something that is a very strong setup in terms of the character and his dynamics. It's something I totally see why other people have worked with this character so often. But like I said, the stories are very constrained by this repetitive format, this the same reveal every single time, and just the mystery stories not being all that interesting. It's just kind of a thing where uh, the stories are very heavily formulaic. They just don't break out of the format that Davis made for them. And this is kind of sad for me because this is a situation where I can tell Frederick C. Davis is a talented writer. He absolutely has great writing ability, but he's just kind of working with a formula, and it's not that great a formula. So all of the good stuff that are in here, I think, are probably things that Davis was really responsible for. All that environmental writing and that setting and Ravenwood's inner conflict. I can tell, yeah, Davis is a very talented writer. I just don't think this particular character and these particular stories are probably, they're not necessarily working. They're essentially being held up by Davis's writing talents. Like, I can see where some other writer might get a hold of this and I might like him even less. But I think Davis is such a talented writer, he does keep interest in the stories, even if they're not necessarily strong mysteries. So, yeah, this is one I kind of feel bad about not enjoying that much because I know other people enjoy them, but yeah, these just didn't really do much for me. I I would say I would, but I actually would recommend this for anybody who's an occult detective fan, because this is a different take on the occult detective, like that idea of uh, superpowered occult detectives, which what is pretty rote today. Tons of other writers have done it, but wasn't as common a trope in the pulp era. You might like this kind of take on the occult detective. So if you're really into occult detectives, it might be worth checking out if you want to see sort of a different take on an occult detective. Any inspiration? For those that don't know, I'm a working writer, and whenever I do these reviews, I like to talk about whether the stories I've read have inspired me in any way. Uh, and this one did, but it was kind of a reverse inspiration. Basically, I was inspired to write not so much because I loved Ravenwood so much as I was going, I think there's a better version of this that I could write. Uh, so this inspired me to write my own occult detective character uh, because I was like, I really want to like Ravenwood, but there's just not, I can't get into him. So I was kind of like, well, let me write my own Ravenwood-esque character. So my my character, I'm still working on him. I'm planning them to have sort of a similar thing with Ravenwood where there is like certain amount of telepathic abilities. but it's much more defined. And there's also going to be connections to spiritualism, but more European mysticism. So that's going to be kind of my take on a Ravenwood type character. So we'll see if that pans out to anything. Well, that's all I have to say about Ravenwood. I'm like I said, I'm kind of bummed I didn't like him more than I did, but that's how it sometimes goes. I'm going to be checking out the rest of the characters featured in Secret Agent X versus Dr. Death. For those that don't know, I have 2 primer videos talking about the characters in them. I'll leave links for them in the description. But I really want to get to those characters because I really wanted to check out Secret Agent X versus Dr. Death this autumn. I really wanted to finally finish reading it this autumn, but I also wanted to finish reading the characters who had who were featured in them. So yeah, that's going to be one of my main goals the next month or two, trying to get through some stories featuring those characters. So you can look forward to those over the next few weeks. And hopefully Secret Agent X versus Dr. Death will be reviewed on this channel in the autumn. So stay tuned for that. And I'm also going to be announcing a new reading event that I'm going to host in September. So keep your eyes out for that. All right. Well, I've talked about this much longer than I thought I would, but I had a lot of feelings about this, so yeah, that's how it goes. All right. Well, keep your eyes out for those reviews, and I will see you guys later. Bye.